Thank you so much. So I hope we can keep this excitement going, and it's great that you're here, because this is not, it's not possible for us to complete the process without your presence. It's not just the making of the art or the presenting of the art, but it's your being here that makes this very special. I often describe the Driskell Center as being in the business of honoring artists, honoring work and honoring us. The Driskell Center is honored to present the opening lecture of the Porter Colloquium. This has been a valued tradition in honor of David C. Driskell and his legacy that was born at Howard University. A special acknowledgement to Dr. Melanie Harvey, Chair of James A. Porter Colloquium and African American Art, who worked with us to arrange tonight's event. Also, let me take the opportunity to express my deep appreciation to the Driskell Center team. David, who just introduced me, Ella, Tamara, Kristen, Karina, and Clea. They have been devoted to the spirit and mission of the center in ways that continues to support our relevancy as a unique and innovative cultural institution. This day of cultural and intellectual celebration began with a stimulating conversation with the acclaimed artist LaToya Hobbs. And that residency and visit and talk had been facilitated by the art department. I think we have someone from the art department here. Oh, in the back. The art department, and of course the dean's office as well of arts and humanities. A special welcome to our guests that include members of the Driskell family, Thelma Driskell, as well as Daphne and Davreen Driskell. And you'll meet the young granddaughter of David Driskell, Alicia, who's become a member of our advisory board. We're very proud of that, keeping that tradition going. But also I want to acknowledge the artists that are with us tonight. Very special artists. Ben Jones, where's Ben at? All right. Willie Cole. Willie Cole is up front here. And we're waiting for Mel Edwards to make a major entrance, but he's not here yet. And of course, a special, oh, Mel, all right. I'm not going to ask him to come up and talk. We'll never get it done. You see, he snuck in without me seeing him. But you know, Mel, we received this major gift from the Mellon Foundation to commission Mel to do a monumental sculpture that will be in honor of David C. Driskell, that will be in the front of the Driskell Center, and the university's made a commitment to create a plaza to house that sculpture. So we're going to be honored by that. So this is great for Mel. And we paid him more than minimum wage to do this. So. Also, we have with us the inaugural recipient of the David C. and David G. Driskell Award for Creative Excellence, just established this year. Lucy, is Lucy in the audience here? From Chile. I might have her stand up here. Lucy is completing her PhD in art history at the University of Texas at Austin. She'll be here for 3-week residencies, working in the center's archives on Afro-Brazilian art practices and histories, and governmental sanctioned initiatives that promoted Afro-Brazilian art during the Brazilian military dictatorship. It is also my pleasure and honor now to introduce our distinguished lecturer, an opening event of Howard's 33rd Annual Porter Colloquium. Dr. Jordana Saggese is Professor of American Art. She is an award-winning scholar whose research focuses on modern and contemporary American art with an emphasis on expressions of Blackness. Professor Saggese's first 2 books have centered on the work of contemporary American artist Jean-Michel Basquiat, one of the most popular yet critically overlooked artists of the 20th century. This book was recognized as an exceptional first book by the Penn Center in USA in 2015 and was reissued in paperback in April of 2021. Professor Saggese is a Jean-Michel Basquiat Reader, writing interviews and critical responses, will be published by the University of California Press of the award-winning Documents of Contemporary Art series. In addition to her achievements as an art historian and author, she has contributed articles to publications such as Art Journal, the International Review of African American Art, Journal of Contemporary Art, Exposure, the Art Forum, as well as international publications. She has lectured in renowned institutions such as Columbia and Princeton universities. She has been interviewed on public radio in the US and the UK. Dr. Saggese's forthcoming book, Heavyweight, Black Boxes and the Fight of Representation, maps the visual terrain of racial ideology in the United States, paying particular attention to the intersecting discourses of blackness, masculinity, and sport in the late 19th century. This new research has been sorted by the Mellon Bruce Senior Visiting Fellowship for the Center of Advanced Study in Visual Arts, National Gallery of Art, Washington, D.C., and the University of Maryland's Independent Scholarship and Research Creativity Awards. Professor Saggese teaching is informed by her interest in history of photography, print culture, abstraction, conceptual art, performance art, post-colonial theory, and disability studies. Professor Saggese offers courses in American art from the colonial period to present, African American art, and critical race art history. At the graduate level, she currently teaches the required methods seminar for the department, as well as special topic seminars in American art, athletic turned sports, and American art in the fall of 2019. An example of this exceptional scholarship and mentorship that Dr. Saggese provides to her students is evidenced by this exhibition that surrounds us. Ringo and Sar, Meeting on the Matrix, was organized by her PhD student group, organized, curated, and now working on a catalog for the exhibition. I would also like to take this opportunity to mention that she will be talking about this year's Distinguished Lecture subject will be This Is Not a Drill, Performance Endurance in the Black Body in Public Space. But before I do that, I'd like to take this opportunity as well to introduce you to the next director of the David C. Driskell Center, Dr. Saggese, which will begin the new directorship on July 1st, 2023. This makes me think of when George Bush, when Obama was elected and George Bush was in front of the White House and Obama was coming to a change guard and he was just dancing on the steps. I don't know if you saw that. I wanted to do a little jig, but I'm not going to do that. Not only is she a brilliant scholar, she is also will be a brilliant director. Dr. Saggese brings to her new role a body of scholarship and African American art history, as well as a passion for teaching the next generation of scholars. The maestro would have been pleased with this selection. Dr. Saggese.
Good evening. There's a lot of y'all. And I hope you'll forgive me for turning down the lights. I'll try to keep you awake. It's just so that we can see the images a little bit more clearly tonight. I want to start us off with a land acknowledgement. Every community owes its existence and strength to the generations before them around the world who contributed their hopes, dreams, and energy into making the history that led to this moment. Some were brought here against their will. Some were drawn to migrate from their homes in hope of a better life. And some have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. Truth and acknowledgement are critical in building mutual respect and connections across all barriers of heritage and difference. So we acknowledge the truth that is often buried. We are on the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people, who were among the first in the Western Hemisphere. We are on indigenous land that was stolen by European colonists. We pay respects to the Piscataway peoples, their elders and ancestors, and I'd like to ask you to please take a moment to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us here today. Before I begin, I also just want to briefly acknowledge that each of you has arrived here tonight with your own unique life experiences. And this will undoubtedly contribute to the way you perceive several types of information. During tonight's lecture, I will address historical subjects and visual images that may be emotionally challenging or disturbing to some, and this includes nudity as well as references to racist violence, including slavery. If you find that any of this causes personal distress, don't worry. I encourage you to take a break. I won't be offended. If you need to step out, what might that be? Or take any other steps that you need to preserve your well-being. All right. So thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you to Curly for that incredibly generous introduction. And I will be happy to talk with you after my lecture about how thrilled I am to step into this exciting role as the next director of the David C. Driskell Center. It's really an honor and a pleasure for me to speak with you tonight about my newest research. And when I say new, I mean new, right? And especially so in the context of this distinguished lecture. I know that for me, as well as for many of you, David was a mentor for my own studies of African American art. He made his reputation as both an artist and a historian by blending the personal with the professional. His contacts with artists informed not only his creative practice, but his scholarship. And we're lucky to have his archives here in the Driskell Center, and those papers, as we go through them, attest to the enormous scope and impact of David's work. My lecture tonight, fittingly, perhaps, focuses on an artist who also benefited from David's mentorship, first as a student and later as a colleague. Born in Washington, D.C., Jefferson Pender received both his BA in theater and his MFA in mixed media from the University of Maryland at College Park. He actually taught here as an assistant professor from 2003 until 2011. As an interdisciplinary artist, Pender gained national attention via his inclusion in the exhibition Frequency, organized by Thelma Golden at the Student Museum in Harlem in 2006. His work has been featured in numerous solo and group shows, including exhibitions at the Student Museum in Harlem, the Wadsworth Atheneum, the High Museum, the National Gallery of Art, the Tate Modern. In 2017, Pender received a Guggenheim Fellowship. He also won a 2016 USA Joyce Fellowship Award in the field of performance art. And most recently, in 2021, he was named a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellow. Over the last 2 decades, Pender has worked across theater, performance, sculpture, and more. I first met him in 2008, right after encountering this video, 2006 Juke, at the Patricia Sweeto Gallery in San Francisco. The title for my lecture tonight, however, is a play on Pender's performance, This Is Not a Drill, which he presented as a limited run engagement in the summer of 2019, the 100-year anniversary of the violent uprising known as the Red Summer. And this was a performance that was actually made here in Washington, D.C. In 2019, and was an occasion for another encounter, luckily for me, with Jefferson and his work. Throughout this performance, Pender and other performers probe into techniques like close order drills, shooter drills, boxing, and bow staff training to explore the potentials of communal strength through ritualized physical routines. He's drawing here on training techniques used by groups like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Black Panther Party, and the Marine Corps. This Is Not a Drill revealed some of the main points of what I see as the constellation that composes his diverse practice. These include the Black body, endurance, and the connections between the physical and our emotional world. Given the diversity of his practice, I'm going to focus tonight on just 4 works by Pender, and they are, in chronological order, Mule from 2006, Passive Resistance from 2008, Thoroughbred from 2014, and most recently, Monumental. My investigation into these works, and indeed into Pender's practice at large, centers on their deployment of the Black body in performance and their engagement with the concept of endurance. More specifically, I argue that Pinder's explorations of the intersections between the real and the imagined possibilities of the Black body in turn provide a counter-argument to the historical myths of Black exceptionalism. So for more than 400 years, Black people in the United States have been haunted by this specter of physicality. This is starting in the 17th century, right? This rhetoric of physical superiority that in part provided the justification for the enslavement of generations of Africans in the diaspora. And after emancipation, Black men specifically were subject to the intersecting discourses of both gender and race, frequently cast as mentally feeble laborers who benefited from the guidance and control of an overwhelmingly exclusionary public policy. We might argue that the stereotype of physical prowess is a precondition of anti-Blackness. And here I'm showing you just two things on the screen. You know, this an article from The Guardian that was talking about sort of this idea of the natural talent, right, of Black athletes. And on the right, you're looking at a quote here by Jimmy the Greek, a radio personality who was fired for this comment, right? I'm talking again about this Black exceptionalism. They're natural, they can do anything. We could argue that framing the Black body as one immune to pain is a precondition of white supremacy. And we've seen this materialize in various forms over the last century, from the surgical experiments performed without anesthesia on enslaved Black women in the 1840s, to even a more recent 2016 survey of second-year medical students in which 40% endorsed a belief that, quote, Black people's skin is thicker than white people's, end quote. 2016. In my most recent book, Heavyweight, I look specifically at images of Black athletes, not only as art objects, but also as cultural artifacts. And in this book, I'm really working from this idea put forward by Stuart Hall in 1997, his lecture, Representation and the Media. And in that lecture, he clarifies the difference between sort of a common understanding of representation, right, sort of representing what is already there, and his understanding of representation. And this is what he says. He talks about representation as entering into the constitution of the object that we are talking about. It is part of the object itself. It is constitutive of it. It is one of its conditions of existence, and therefore representation is not outside the event, not after the event, but within the event itself. Hall's basically arguing here that images that circulate in the media illustrate the ways that the ways in which Black bodies are viewed by audiences, regardless of gender or sexual orientation. And this is a pattern that connects back even to Reconstruction era expressions of white mainstream anxieties and potential fantasies about the Black body. Working from Hall's definition of representation, I've considered the ways in which images of Black male boxers, I could talk about this photograph for hours, constitute the definition and the experience of Black masculinity, and how these representations work to position Black men as ambivalent objects of both our fear and our desire. That book's central concern, that is how Black men become the most threatening of all, has very real consequences in the present. So consider, for example, the proliferation, right, of murder by unarmed Black men by the police that have become an intrinsic and disturbing part of our visual landscape over the last decade. In the years that have passed since the murder of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin in Sanford, Florida, we've all been witness to a relentless explosion of anti-Black violence. We've been compelled to watch, via the somewhat chilling availability of video footage, the murders of unarmed boys and men, right, by police ad infinitum. So we've seen this happen over and over again. Their collective crimes, right, selling loose cigarettes, walking on a public street, playing with a toy, holding a knife, driving with a non-functioning brake light, paying for a pack of cigarettes with a counterfeit bill, sleeping in a car, quickly escalated by officers who immediately and tragically identified them as a threat. So I say all of this to talk about sort of the stereotype of physical prowess, threat of the Black male body in public space is without a doubt a precondition, right, of anti-Black violence. Jefferson Pender has spoken of his own use of the body, and we might imagine, in this case, the bodies of others that he uses in performance, as, quote, a tool and a weapon. The weaponizing of the body is one way that these performances resist the more typical binary of active performer and passive viewer. In viewing these performances, we are made complicit in these acts as we witness these bodies work themselves to exhaustion, struggling to keep up, or maybe even overcome by gravitational force for an undetermined amount of time. And we can argue that the true subject of these works is endurance, defined most simply as an ability to persist within a difficult situation or to continue to act despite a wound or fatigue. Across this series of performances categorized by Pender as part of his inertia cycle, we witness him running, riding a stationary bike, moving an inert vehicle with a mass of pedestrians, rowing, or running through the streets of Minneapolis. And in all of these, we are forced to consider the limits of the body. In the words of scholar Isaiah Wooden, who wrote about Ben-Hur, the piece you're looking here on the screen, Pender, quote, provides a literal platform to rehearse and enact various forms of non-compliance, end quote. As each performer tries to execute the task before them, they do so in opposition to the obstacles they face. As they strive to endure these taxing physical feats, in this case rowing, their ability to persist may in fact speak to the challenge Black bodies present to the oppressive structures and systems that attempt to limit them. These works, in Pender's words, quote, explore physicality and intense exertion as relating to the Black body, end quote. They portray the theatrics of physical labor. And they are also, in part, ultimate refusals of the pressures to endure. I am interested in these performances by Jefferson Pender because they explicitly focus on the intersections between what I've called those real and imagined possibilities of Black athleticism. In the 2006 performance Mule, for example, Pender films his journey down a Baltimore sidewalk while dragging a weight. This is a 300-pound log covered with tin from a chain that's attached to a chest harness. Under the harness, the artist wears a gray suit and tie, as well as a pair of goggles that he's modified to restrict his vision so that he can only see what appears directly in front of him. He begins the route almost standing upright and leaning forward at an acute angle, and other shots of the performance show Pender moving closer and closer to the ground on hands and knees in an attempt to create that sufficient force to displace the weight. In conjunction with the quote-unquote blinders Pender wears, he is not quite transformed throughout the performance of Mule into a beast of burden. And here again, the body becomes a site of struggle as the performance makes visible the weight of stereotype. 2 years after Mule, Pender filmed Passive Resistance, a collaboration. And here we see the two-channel video that was presented with a left view with Pender himself on the left and the right view with Matt Ravenstall, who is his collaborator for this particular work. I'm going to play, hopefully, a short clip from this for you so you can see exactly what's happening in this performance. So as the video begins, both men look toward a center line. There's actually, in this video, no sound for the first 10 seconds. That is until we see and hear that white hand enter the left video and slap Pinder's face with an open hand. As the hand makes contact, we have that loud snap. And Pinder's face moves in the direction of his hand with his eyes briefly closing. However, just as quickly as the slap occurs, Pinder opens his eyes and returns to his opening position. There's a pause for just 3 seconds before Ravenstall strikes again, this time from the opposite side. And the pattern repeats again and again. If you are able to watch for the duration of the video, which is 5 minutes, 10 seconds, you will see Pinder slapped a total of 83 times. No discernible pattern emerges regarding the side of the face to receive the blow or their pacing. In fact, after the first 4 minutes, the speed of delivery increases significantly, seemingly without reason. Although the facial expression of the white figure does not change over the course of the performance, we do witness Pinder react, right? We briefly see him close his eyes. In other cases, he will lick his lips. He offers several deep exhales. He even scans the body of his so-called opponent and even smirks a few times. A challenge to view either in part or as a whole, the video becomes the most uncomfortable when the quote-unquote beatdown comes to an end and both performers turn their gaze toward the camera. According to Pinder, passive resistance, quote, demonstrates the heroics and absurdity of the essence of the passive resistance techniques used in the civil rights struggles of the 1960s. But this performance also does something more. As viewers and indeed as witnesses to this scene, we are implicated in the violence before us. We are reminded of our role, as the scholar Lee Rayford has described, quote, in the constant mediated repetition of the Black body in pain for public consumption. Rayford's words were deployed in reference to lynching photographs, right, which circulated endlessly in the late 19th and early 20th century. These were visual testaments to public murder as well as evidence of white racialized anxiety. Pinder's performance as passive here is on its face a form of resistance, but the question becomes, what exactly is being resisted? So that quote from Pinder, he's reminding us that the 1960s resistance movement promoted passivity in the hope of avoiding further physical or psychological abuse. In the years before the emergence of the Black Panthers, who advocated for the open carry of legally issued guns, protesters across the Jim Crow South promoted nonviolent action, right, through freedom rides, boycotts, marches, and they do all this over, right, prioritizing an over-violent encounter. We see Pinder here in this work enact key principles, right, of Martin Luther King Jr.'s theories on nonviolence, which I'm putting up here, these were theories that were articulated in his first book, Stride Toward Freedom, which was published in 1958 as a memoir of the Montgomery bus boycott of 55 and 56. And in that particular book, what King is arguing for is nonviolence. He writes, those committed to nonviolence must be willing to suffer without retaliation, as suffering itself can be redemptive, end quote. Of course, we all know that the suffering itself could lead toward death, right, as is the case for so many. With passive resistance, Pinder reconsiders the purpose as well as the overall effect of this endurance. As he turns to meet our gaze at the end of that video, it's as if to prove to us that passivity often fails to create justice. In Thoroughbred from 2014, Pinder continues to question the limits of endurance, focusing us on the failures of the Black body. Thoroughbred is, of course, a term used most often to describe the level of purity in a breed of horse, right? That is one specifically designed for racing. But the reference to animality in Pinder's adoption of the term for this is not incidental. For one, right, we might think of the ways in which enslaved Black men were once described as thoroughbreds at auction, as if to underscore that myth of innate physical strength. So you're looking here at a performance that took place inside a small Chicago gallery, Sector 2337, where Pinder has arranged 4 amateur runners on treadmills that the artist, via a handmade conversion kit, you can actually see him in the very back of that image in sort of a vest and dress shirt. He's sitting in front of a table where he has sort of a handmade control box, right? And there are dials connected to each of these 4 treadmills that he can turn on, speed up, and turn off at will. And each of these treadmills, he's equipped with this clamp-on floodlight, which he cannot tell me what kind it was, because who asks such questions besides art historians, that turns off and on in sync with the running belt of the machine, right? So once the machine starts, the light comes on. Once they stop the machine, the light turns off. So at the start of the performance, the lights of the gallery dim and the lamps turn on. This incandescent light bathes the torso of each figure, creating a visual analog to classical sculpture, as we're allowed to trace the contours and the shadows of these bodies before us. After the ring of a single bell, Pinder activates the sequence of treadmills. He starts from the front and works to the back. And as they begin to move, each performer, this is your warning, disrobes to reveal a body that is completely nude, save a pair of sneakers. So I'm going to play a clip of this performance. So I'm not going to show you the whole performance because essentially, as you'll see as I talk about it, the point is that it's a really long performance, right? It ends when the last runner is exhausted, okay, and is unable to continue. So as you can see here, they actually begin in unison. They pump their arms, right, of these nude bodies. We see them inhaling and exhaling in a slow march that eventually transforms into a brisk walk. At each subsequent ring of the bell, the speed continues to increase and the paces and abilities of each body begin to diverge. Individual runners begin to struggle with the pace, and eventually, one by one, they stop the moving belts and extinguish their lights. While we may be interested as viewers to see which runners prevail, I won't reveal, the point in Thoroughbred is not their ability to resist that exhaustion. The point instead is that none possibly can. Here, these bodies, and we might argue all Black bodies, counter the stereotype of inhuman or even bestial strength through their eventual and expected failure. This nudity allows us not only to witness the movement of their individual limbs as they complete these tasks, but also to contend with the explicitly human form. So, I'm an art historian, right? I'm thinking about a long history of American art, and when I'm encountering work like with Pinder, I'm thinking about how does this fit, right, within a history that we already have, right? A history performance that is long, right? It goes all the way back to the early 20th century, right, in Europe. And one of the things that I'm often sort of thinking about is this, right? We have a long history of endurance-based performance. And this is specific to contemporary American art and they're evaluated most often on the subject's ability to resist pain. This was an extremely rich mode of art production in the 1970s, where a class of artists, mostly white men, explored endurance by putting their own bodies at risk. So this is one example. You're seeing here a shirtless Dennis Oppenheim who lay in direct sun on the sand of Jones Beach for 4 to 5 hours with a book splayed across his chest so that the spine faces upward. And the resulting photographs from the performance showed the two phases of Oppenheim's performance, right? In the top image, you're seeing the book that's actually titled Tactics, Cavalry, Artillery, atop the artist's torso, while in the lower image, you're seeing the result, right, of that sun exposure recorded in the rectangle of pale skin that takes the place in the shape of the book once removed. In this same period, the Los Angeles-based artist Chris Burden became infamous for exposing his body to violence, right? And so you're looking here at a performance Shoot, right, where he directed an assistant to shoot him in the arm with a .22 caliber rifle. And again in 1974, where a shirtless Burden was attached to the rear of a VW Beetle with 2 nails hammered to his open palms and through the car's roof. This is a work called Transfixed from 1974. And in the work I Like America and America Likes Me, the German immigrant artist Joseph Beuys spent 3 consecutive days, 8 hours at a time, locked inside a small room at the René Bloch Gallery. The room contained heaps of straw, several copies of the Wall Street Journal from each day, and Beuys, as you can see here on the screen, wrapped himself in a large piece of felt and held a wooden cane, which he used both to interact with and to defend against the room's only other inhabitant, and that was a wild coyote. While perhaps a bit eccentric or even dangerous on its surface, according to Beuys, the coyote represented the spirit of America. Many of the performance works from this period have been recognized by critics for their direct engagement of politics, right? So if you're looking in the case of Oppenheim, critics have interpreted that choice of book, right, Tactics, as directly related to the strategic deployment of napalm by the United States Army in Vietnam, the burning of his own skin being perhaps an analog to the effects of chemical warfare. They draw a connection between the vulnerability of Oppenheim's body and other bodies under the influence of war-making governments. And as Beuys interacted with the coyote, its increasing passivity was interpreted as evidence of the healing power of cooperation and mutual understanding in a time of deep political divides. And of course, we have to consider these works in relation to pain. Okay, this is where it gets a little theoretical. In her 2005 book, The Cultural Politics of Emotion, Sarah Ahmed enters into the relationship between politics and pain. That is, how does, in Ahmed's words, the labor of pain and the language of pain work in specific and determined ways to affect difference between bodies? Pain, she argues, is not necessarily a private experience, but it surfaces in relationship to others. That is, pain only exists via the recognition by someone else who witness it, right, and authenticate its existence, right? Anyone who has a toddler understands this concept, right? If you react, right, when they stumble, it's, oh my gosh, yes, this hurts, right? If you don't react, it's no big deal. Ahmed argues the following, quote, "The experience of pain does not cut off the body in the present, but attaches this body to the world of other bodies," end quote. So she's saying that pain introduces contingency. Perhaps more important, Ahmed suggests that more familiar narratives about pain reify normative standards of bodily integrity that are based on an idealized model, right? And this model is inherently raced, gendered, and sexualized. We assume this ideal, right? A white, heterosexual male subject whose bodily integrity is threatened by harmful external forces. These narratives reproduce discourses of oppression by positioning the right to voice one's pain and pain itself as an entitlement to which those in positions of privilege have greater access, right? So the question I'm asking here is, does the pain endured by Oppenheim mean something different than the pain endured by Pindar? Before I conclude, I want to briefly touch on this work. This is the 2021 performance Monumental, a more recent contribution to what I introduced at the beginning, Pindar's inertia cycle. This debuted at the Untitled Art Fair in Miami. And for the duration of the performance, Pindar, dressed again in that gray suit with black tie and black shoes, hangs suspended from a harness over a wooden block that's been painted white. Atop this pedestal, which has been consciously shaped to resemble those all too familiar plinths supporting Confederate monuments, Pindar cycles through a series of movements. He begins, as you see here on the screen, with his arms stretched out while his legs dangle vertically, before he transitions to a series of bicycle sort of running movements in which he raises one knee with the opposite arm and twists his torso. He returns to a vertical position again, right, this time with his arms arranged in that downward V shape, elevated just so slightly above his hips. And as he takes a brief exhale, Pindar then repositions himself so that he holds his knees, right, in this slightly curved position. As he creates these poses and struggles to rebalance between them, we notice the signs of exertion on his face, and we see his chest rise and fall with each deep sigh. Here again, I would argue that he inserts himself into that long history, right, of Black embodiments of disobedience. And he's resisting here and refusing, right, the forces of gravity, the stares of the viewers, and a history of art that declares some bodies as monumental and others as inconsequential. Pindar's work, more importantly, highlights the failures of a history of performance to consider the specific conditions of endurance and its relationship to pain when the subject, not to mention the viewer, is Black. I would like to borrow a phrase from Lee Rayford, whose study, as I mentioned before, of lynching photography, undoubtedly, right, a touch point in sort of the visual iconography you're looking here at in Pindar's Monumental. She's talking about, this constant mediated repetition of the Black body in pain for public consumption. But the key element to me in Pindar's performance is this refusal to even consider Black pain, right? We know that this conception of the body as incapable of suffering, right, is that underlying principle that continues to reverberate in our present moment. This is just another close-up image of Pindar as he hangs there for the duration of this performance. Working with sweat and making visible the struggle to meet these physical demands, Pindar disrupts the dominant understanding of the Black body as one incapable of suffering and immune to pain. We see in real time the endurance that is required not only to carry out these tasks, but also to exist in the world as a Black man, to continue living despite our collective fatigue. As these Black bodies exert themselves to the point of exhaustion, they do not demonstrate their strength as much as their humanity. And in doing so, they enact a refusal. They disobey and they become unruly. So when I was starting this lecture, I was reading about the death of the 29-year-old Tyree Nichols, right? Who was pushed to the ground and kicked in the face and relentlessly attacked by 5 police officers for 13 excruciating minutes during a traffic stop. And I wonder, how do we continue to watch? How do we continue to breathe? As Bell Hooks reminds us, quote, changing representations of Black men must be a collective task. The work of Jefferson Pender complicates a history of anti-Blackness that has true and often devastating consequences in our present. His performances bridge the gap between that physical and emotional life, presenting to us the problems of duration, pain, and failure, to explore the affective dimensions of what it means to endure. And maybe it is by pushing and by fighting and even by failing that we can find a way to live. Thank you. I've been told there are no questions. You just have to come find me. I'm just kidding. Is that true? We have to take some questions. Let's do it. Yes, please. Oh, monumental? It's about half an hour. Yeah, and it's what was really interesting to me about Pender, because I was trying to make this in the talk, I was really thinking a lot in the last few years about Black athletes. And one of the things that's really so striking about Pender's work is sort of the extreme athleticism that is required to do his performances, right? And he's someone who is very committed to physically preparing and training for these tasks. He has a military background. He grew up here. But as you watch the performance, it doesn't matter how much training you have, right? And that is the really hard part, is the duration of the film, and you can see it, right? It's on Vimeo. The duration is really about sort of him necessarily failing and taking these breaks and wobbling, right? That's as much part of the performance as those sort of execution of those poses. Yeah. Yeah.
To witness Monumental, and when I say it was just incredibly exhausting, strenuous, difficult to witness and consider, it was hard. And as someone who admires Jefferson's work and a friend, it was hard.
Yes.
I cried almost the entire time. I want to cry now seeing it.
Yes.
But how much into what you interpret his work in terms of the endurance of the performance are you looking at the audience's reaction, also in relation to athletic performances where the audience is like, yeah, go do this. Whereas, the emotional reaction is different.
Yeah, no, I think that's a wonderful question. And absolutely, I am interested, particularly in Jefferson's performance as a vehicle for me, right? To think through exactly what I was talking about, this binary between sort of an active performer and a passive viewer, right? That he relies on affect to draw us in a really interesting way. And, I might argue that the history that we currently have of performance art does not account as much as it could for that relationship, right, between the viewer and the participant. And part of that is because, we are trained to kind of think of the body in performance as sort of a neutral body, and we're sort of thinking about the audience as a universal audience. And what's interesting to me is exactly what you're talking about, is the relationship between the viewing by a viewer who is Black, right? It is a person of color, is a victim of violence in their own lives, and someone who's coming from without, right? I think that's one of the reasons. For me, I think that's one of the reasons that Pender's practice hasn't really been taken up historically or critically, is because it troubles that sort of relationship that we have to understand that viewer-performer binary. Yeah, it was a great question. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for Pender, but who's born in 1970?
Yeah.
And Hotel was born in 1954. You spoke to Pender. What's his relationship with Hotel?
I haven't spoken to Jefferson about Popel, but they are definitely operating in a similar space. I think that I've been thinking a lot about Popel's sort of Superman crawls, right, through New York, and that mule. And there's a couple of differences that I think gets back to your question too about why Jefferson's work is a little bit different and a little bit stranger. One thing I noticed is that of course he's adding a 300-pound log, right? He's literally transforming himself into a beast, right? Sort of those blinders on, the goggles. I think that's one thing that's a little bit different here. The other piece of it, and I think this is really one of the reasons why I'm interested in Pender's work, is because unlike Popel's, where the work exists, and this is very typical of performance art, right? Like the performance is the performance, and the work that exists is like some photos that were hastily taken along the way, right, as you performed. And what's different about Jefferson's work is we have just this sleek video, right? This sort of record of the performance, and it has music and lighting. And this in part, attests to his background in theater, right? And so the question for me, in thinking about someone like Popel, right, who's working in performance and documentation, that's a really clear construction, and we have a way of understanding the relationship between the document and the performance. What we don't have with Pender is a clear understanding, like of sort of the documentation versus the performance versus the video, the performance versus us watching it, right? There's a little bit, it sort of expands out in a way that I think at least I don't yet, have a way of really interpreting, right? So when I say this is new, I mean like new, right? I've been talking to Jefferson for a long time, and we were just in a conversation, and I said, I think you're ready for like a monograph. I think you're ready for someone to figure out what's going on here. And we really do, I think for a lot of artists, most recently we had a really lovely book come out about Carrie Mae Weems that no one could really handle, right, for the first couple of decades of her career. And I think it's because he's engaging in all of these various discourses at once around theater, performance, documentation, film, music, right, athleticism. And so this is my opportunity to kind of try to bring some of those threads together. Yeah. Yeah.
So I really appreciate that you bring to experience Jefferson Pender. You've helped us in a way in which I haven't really lifted him in that way, which is really good. So we need scholars like yourself and others to kind of lift this. I'm thinking of Daniela Fraser right now, because she was a bystander of a lynching, and you've helped me to kind of understand my own role as a viewer, my bystandership. And so right now I'm doing a lot of thinking about bystandership in policing. And so this is going to kind of put me on a point of departure about the role of the arts in helping us understand our better understanding of policy. So I'm really appreciating your lifting this for us.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think that there's, I would always recommend, I'm a teacher at heart, right? So I'm always going to recommend things for you to read. So, for me, Teju Cole's Death in the Browser tab was really important for thinking through the circulation of images of violence and the ways that we kind of become conditioned to that. And I think, one of the things that your comment brings up for me is something that I've been thinking about with Jefferson is, the circulation of these performances, the circulation of these videos, right? Because he actually does very tightly control the documentation, right? And I think that that's intentional, right? Because there is something about, as we were talking about before, it's difficult, right, to watch, it's painful. And I think that, for a lot of artists that are working in this space, there's also a question of how much am I contributing to that visual imaginary, right? And how much am I critiquing it? And I think that, that's a difficult balance, right, to strike, yeah.
I don't know if this is a question, but maybe you could just help me clarify this thought. I was thinking about the difference between the emotional space and the physical space in Jefferson's work. So with the emotional space, he's kind of breaking the fourth wall and engaging empathy as a medium within the work. But then in the physical space, in the gallery setting, if you're looking at his work compared to Joseph Beuys, the gallery frames it in this pristine environment, kind of like in Miami. Whereas when he's dragging the work to Baltimore, in Mule, and I'm thinking about maybe an artist like Anna Mendieta, who's in a natural environment outside. I'm thinking about the framing within the gallery versus the exterior physical space. Anyway, I'm just kind of processing.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of a difference for me when I'm thinking about those performances that you mentioned, like Mendieta and Beuys, because again, you have sort of that, there's an isolation, right? Mendieta is performing those for the camera, right? With just one person taking those photographs, and Beuys is similarly isolated, right? With just the coyote, and as much as maybe, Sector 237 is not a pristine space, so in Chicago at all, and part of it is that close physicality that you have. Like if you look at installation shots of that, like they're on the treadmill, like as I'm in a relationship, right, to this front row, right? So there isn't an ability for you to not be in the performance. And I think, this goes back to Jefferson's, training in theater, right? It's always this sort of, participatory, you're always implicated, right, in the performance. And I think that he is always thinking about that, right? He's doing it, on the street or in the gallery, but he's almost never performing alone, right, for the camera. And that's really interesting to me, because that's not something that we see a lot in this type of performance. Yeah. I'm going to let you all go. Thank you so much.
Please join us for a reception outside. We can
Get a drink. Get some food.
ask the